Section 13 of About Orchids, a Chat. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Peter Yearsley. About Orchids, a Chat by Frederick Boyle. Chapter 8. An Orchid Farm. Section 2. But we must not pass a new orchid, quite distinct and supremely beautiful, for which Professor Reichenbach has not yet found a name sufficiently appreciative. Only 8 pieces were discovered, whence we must suspect that it is very rare at home. I do not know where the home is, and I should not tell if I did. Such information is more valuable than the surest tip for the Derby, or most secrets of state. This new orchid is a chiropetalon, of a very small size, but like so many others its flower is bigger than itself. The spike inclines almost at a right angle, and the pendant half is hung with golden bells, nearly 2 inches in length. Beneath it stands the very rare scarlet utricularia, growing in the axils of its native Vriesia, as in a cup always full. But as yet the flower has been seen in Europe only by the eyes of faith. It may be news to some that utricularias do not belong to the orchid family, have in fact not the slightest kinship, though associated with it by growers to the degree that Mr. Sander admits them to his farm. A little story hangs to the exquisite Utricularia Campbelli. All importers are haunted by the spectral image of Cattleya labiata, which in its true form had been brought to Europe only once, 70 years ago, when this book was written. Some time since, Mr. Sander was looking through the drawings of Sir Robert Schomburgk in the British Museum, among which is a most eccentric Cattleya, named, for reasons beyond comprehension, a variety of Cattleya Mossiae. He jumped at the conclusion that this must be the long-lost Cattleya labiata. So strong indeed was his confidence that he dispatched a man post-haste over the Atlantic to explore the Roraima mountain, and further gave him strict injunctions to collect nothing but this precious species. For 8 months the traveller wandered up and down among the Indians, searching forest and glade, the wooded banks of streams, the rocks and clefts, but he found neither C. labiata nor that curious plant which Sir Robert Schomburgk described. Upon the other hand, he came across the lovely Utricularia Campbelli, and, in defiance of instructions, brought it down. But very few reached England alive. For 6 weeks they travelled on men's backs from their mountain home to the river Essequibo, thence 6 weeks in canoe to Georgetown with 20 portages, and so aboard ship. The single chance of success lies in bringing them down undisturbed in the great clumps of moss which are their habitat, as is the Vriesia of other species. I will allow myself a very short digression here. It may seem unaccountable that a plant of large growth, distinct flower, and characteristic appearance should elude the eye of persons trained to such pursuits, and encouraged to spend money on the slightest prospect of success, for half a century and more. But if we recall the circumstances, it ceases to astonish. I myself spent many months in the forests of Borneo, Central America, and the West African coast. After that experience, I scarcely understand how such a quest for a given object can ever be successful unless by mere fortune. To look for a needle in a bottle of hay is a promising enterprise compared with the search for an orchid clinging to some branch high up in that green world of leaves. As a matter of fact, collectors seldom discover what they are specially charged to seek, if the district be untravelled. The natives, therefore, untrained to grasp and assist their purpose. This remark does not apply to orchids alone, not by any means. Few besides the scientific, probably, are aware that the common Eucharis amasonica has been found only once. That is to say, but one consignment has ever been received in Europe, from which all our millions in cultivation have descended. Where it exists in the native state is unknown, but assuredly this ignorance is nobody's fault. For a generation at least, skilled explorers have been hunting. Mr. Sander has had his turn, and has enjoyed the satisfaction of discovering species closely allied, as Eucharis mastersii and Eucharis sanderiana, but the old-fashioned bulb is still to seek. In this third greenhouse is a large importation of Cattleya trianae, which arrived so late last year that their sheaths have opened contemporaneously with C. mossii. I should fear to hazard a guess how many thousand flowers of each are blooming now. As the Odontoglossums cover their stage with snow wreaths, so this is decked with upright plumes of Cattleya trianae, white and rose and purple, in endless varieties of tint, with many a streak of other hue between. Suddenly our guide becomes excited, staring at a basket overhead beyond reach. It contains a smooth-looking object, very green and fat, which must surely be good to eat. But this observation is alike irrelevant and disrespectful. Why, yes, beyond all possibility of doubt, that is a spike issuing from the axil of its fleshy leaf. 3 inches long it is already, thick as a pencil, with a big knob of bud at the tip. Such pleasing surprises befall the Orchidacean. This plant came from Borneo so many years ago that the record is lost, but the oldest servant of the farm remembers it as a poor cripple hanging between life and death, season after season. Cheerful as interesting is the discussion that arises, more like a Vanda than anything else, the authorities resolve, but not a Vanda. Commending it to the special care of those responsible, we pass on. Here is the largest mass of Catasetum ever found, or even rumoured, lying in ponderous bulk upon the stage, much as it lay in a Guatemalan forest. It is engaged in the process of plumping up. Orchids shrivel in their long journey, and it is the importer's first care to renew that smooth and wholesome rotundity which indicates a conscience untroubled, a good digestion, and an assurance of capacity to fulfil any reasonable demand. Beneath the staging you may see myriads of withered sticks, clumps of shrunken and furrowed bulbs by the thousand, hung above those leaf beds mentioned. They are plumping in the damp shade. The larger pile of Catasetum, there are 2, may be 4 feet long, 3 wide, and 18 inches thick. How many hundreds of flowers it will bear passes computation. I remarked that when broken up into handsome pots it would fill a greenhouse of respectable dimensions, but it appears that there is not the least intention of dividing it. The farmer has several clients who will snap at this natural curiosity when, in due time, it is put on the market. At the far end of the house stands another piece of rock work, another little cascade, and more marvels than I can touch upon. In fact, there are several which would demand all the space at my disposition, but happily one reigns supreme. This is a Cattleya mossii, the pendant of the Catasetum, by very far the largest orchid of any kind that was ever brought to Europe. For some years Mr. Sander, so to speak, hovered round it, employing his shrewdest and most diplomatic agents. For this was not a forest specimen. It grew upon a high tree beside an Indian's hut, near Caracas, and belonged to him as absolutely as the fruit in his compound. His great-grandfather, indeed, had planted it, so he declared, but this is highly improbable. The giant has embraced 2 stems of the tree, and covers them both so thickly that the bare ends of wood at top alone betray its secret, for it was sawn off, of course, above and below. I took the dimensions as accurately as may be, with an object so irregular and prickly. It measures, the solid bulk of it, leaves not counted, as nearly as possible 5 feet in height and 4 thick. One plant, observe, pulsating through its 1,000 limbs from one heart. At least, I mark no spot where the circulation has been checked by accident or disease, and the pseudo-bulbs beyond have been obliged to start an independent existence. In speaking of Loelia elegans, I said that those Brazilian islanders who have lost it might find solace could they see its happiness in exile. The gentle reader thought this an extravagant figure of speech, no doubt, but it is not wholly fanciful. Indians of tropical America cherish a fine orchid to the degree that in many cases no sum and no offer of valuables will tempt them to part with it. Ownership is distinctly recognized when the specimen grows near a village. The root of this feeling, whether superstition or taste, sense of beauty, rivalry in magnificence of church displays, I have not been able to trace. It runs very strong in Costa Rica, where the influence of the aborigines is scarcely perceptible, and there at least the latter motive is sufficient explanation. Glorious beyond all our fancy can conceive must be the show in those lonely forest churches, which no European visits save the collector on a feast day. Mr. Yearsley, whose name is so familiar to botanists, left a description of the scene that time he first beheld the fleur de majo. The church was hung with garlands of it, he says, and such emotion seized him at the view that he choked. The statement is quite credible. Those who see that wonder now, prepared for its transcendent glory, find no words to express their feelings. Imagine an enthusiast beholding it for the first time, unwarned, unsuspecting that earth can show such a sample of the flowers that bloomed in Eden. And not a single branch, but garlands of it. Mr. Yearsley proceeds to speak of bouquets of Masdevallia harryana 3 feet across, and so forth. The natives showed him gardens devoted to this species for the ornament of their church. It was not cultivated, of course, but evidently planted. They were acres in extent. The Indian to whom this Cattleya mossiae belonged refused to part with it at any price for years. He was overcome by a rifle of peculiar fascination, added to the previous offers. A magic lantern has very great influence in such cases, and the collector provides himself with one or more nowadays as part of his outfit. Under that charm, with £47 in cash, Mr. Sander secured his first C. mossiae alba, but it has failed hitherto in another instance, though backed by £100 in trade or dollars at the Indian's option. Thence we passed to a wide and lofty house, which was designed for growing Victoria regia and other tropic water lilies. It fulfilled its purpose for a time, and I never beheld those plants under circumstances so well fitted to display their beauty. But they generate a small black fly in myriads beyond belief, and so the culture of Nymphaea was dropped. A few remain in manageable quantities, just enough to adorn the tank with blue and rosy stars, but it is arched over now with baskets as thick as they will hang, Dendrobium, Coelogene, Oncidium, Spathoglottis, and those species which love to dwell in the neighbourhood of steaming water. My vocabulary is used up by this time. The wonders here must go unchronicled. We have viewed but 4 houses out of 12. A most cursory glance at that. The next also is intermediate, filled with Cattleyas, warm Oncidiums, Lycastes, Cypripediums. The inventory of names alone would occupy all my space remaining. At every step I mark some object worth a note, something that recalls or suggests or demands a word. But we must get along. The 6th house is cool again, Odontoglossums and such. The 7th is given to Dendrobes, but facing us as we enter stands a Lycaste Skinneri, which illustrates in a manner almost startling the infinite variety of the orchid. I positively dislike this species, obtrusive, pretentious, vague in colour, and stiff in form. But what a royal glorification of it we have here! What exquisite veining and edging of purple or rose! What a velvet lip of crimson darkening to claret! It is merely a sport of nature, but she allows herself such glorious freaks in no other realm of her domain. And here is a new Brassia, just named by the Pontiff of Orchidology, Professor Reichenbach. Those who know the tribe of Brassias will understand why I make no effort to describe it. This wonderful thing is yet more all over the shop than its kindred. Its dorsal sepal measures 3 inches in length, its tail 5 inches, with an enormous lip between. They term it the squid flower, or octopus, in Mexico, and a good name too. But in place of the rather weakly colouring habitual, it has a grand decision of character, though the tones are like, pale yellow and greenish. Its raised spots, red and deep green, are distinct as points of velvet upon muslin. In the 8th house we return to Odontoglossums and cool genera. Here are a number of hybrids of the natural class, upon which I should have a good deal to say if inexorable fate permitted. Natural hybrids are plants which seem species, but upon thoughtful examination and study are suspected to be the offspring of kindred and neighbours. Interesting questions arise in surveying fine specimens side by side, in flower, all attributed to a cross between Odontoglossum Lindleyanum and Odontoglossum crispum Alexandræ, and all quite different. But we must get on to the 9th house, from which the 10th branches. Here is the stove, and twilight reigns over that portion where a variety of supertropic genera are plumping up, making roots, and generally reconciling themselves to a new start in life. Such dainty, delicate souls may well object to the apprenticeship. It must seem very degrading to find themselves laid out upon a bed of cinders and moss, hung up by the heels above it, and even planted therein. But if they have as much good sense as some believe, they may be aware that it is all for their good. At the end, in full sunshine, stands a little copse of Vanda teres, set as closely as their stiff branches will allow. Still, we must get on. There are bits of wood hanging here so rotten that they scarcely hold together. Faintest dots of green upon them assure the experienced that presently they will be draped with pendant leaves, and presently again, we hope, with blue and white and scarlet flowers of Utricularia. From the stove opens a very long, narrow house, where cool genera are plumping, laid out on moss and potsherds. Many of them have burst into strong growth. Pleiones are flowering freely as they lie. This farmer's crops come to harvest faster than he can attend to them. Things beautiful and rare and costly are measured here by the yard. So many feet of this piled up on the stage, so many of the other, from all quarters of the world, waiting the leisure of these busy agriculturists. Nor can we spare them more than a glance. The next house is filled with Odontoglossums, planted out like bedding stuff in a nursery, awaiting their turn to be potted. They make a carpet so close, so green, that flowers are not required to charm the eye as it surveys the long perspective. The rest are occupied just now with cargoes of imported plants. My pages are filled. To what poor purpose, seeing how they might have been used for such a theme? No one could be so conscious as I. End of section 13. About Orchids, a chat. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Peter Yearsley. About Orchids, a chat, by Frederick Boyle. Chapter 9. Orchids and Hybridizing. Section 1. In the very first place, I declare that this is no scientific chapter. It is addressed to the thousands of men and women in the realm who tend a little group of orchids lovingly, and mark the wonders of their structure with as much bewilderment as interest. They read of hybridization, they see the result in costly specimens, they get books, they study papers on the subject. But the deeper their research commonly, the more they become convinced that these mysteries lie beyond their attainment. I am not aware of any treatise which makes a serious effort to teach the uninitiated. Putting technical expressions on one side, though that obstacle is grave enough, every one of those which has come under my notice takes the mechanical preliminaries for granted. All are written by experts for experts. My purpose is contrary. I wish to show how it is done so clearly that a child, or the dullest gardener, may be able to perform the operations, so very easy when you know how to set to work. After a single lesson in the genus Cypripedium alone, a young lady of my household amused herself by concerting the most incredible alliances: Dendrobium with Odontoglossum, Epidendrum with Oncidium, Oncidium with Odontoglossum, and so forth. It is unnecessary to tell the experienced that in every case the seed vessel swelled. That matter will be referred to presently. I mention the incident only to show how simple are these processes if the key be grasped. Amateur hybridizers of an audacious class are wanted, because hitherto operators have kept so much to the beaten paths. The names of Veitch and Dominy and Seddon will endure when those of great savants are forgotten, but business men have been obliged to concentrate their zeal upon experiments that pay. Fantastic crosses mean, in all probability, a waste of time, space, and labour. In fact, it is not until recent years that such attempts could be regarded as serious. So much the more creditable, therefore, are Messrs. Veitch's exertions in that line. But it seems likely to me that when hybridizing becomes a common pursuit with those who grow orchids, and the time approaches fast, a very strange revolution may follow. It will appear, as I think, that the enormous list of pure species, even genera, recognized at this date, may be thinned in a surprising fashion. I believe, timidly, as becomes the unscientific, that many distinctions which anatomy recognizes at present as essential to a true species will be proved in the future to result from promiscuous hybridization through aeons of time. Proved, perhaps, is the word too strong, since human life is short, but such a mass of evidence will be collected that reasonable men can entertain no doubt. Of course the species will be retained, but we shall know it to be a hybrid, the offspring, perhaps, of hybrids innumerable. I incline more and more to think that even genera may be disturbed in a surprising fashion, and I know that some great authorities agree with me outright, though they are unprepared to commit themselves at present. A very few years ago this suggestion would have been absurd, in the sense that it wanted facts in support. As our ancestors have made it an article of faith that to fertilize an orchid was impossible for man, so we imagined, until lately, that genera would not mingle. But this belief grows unsteady. Though bi-generic crosses have not been much favoured, as offering little prospect of success, such results have been obtained already that the field of speculation lies open to irresponsible persons like myself. When Cattleya has been allied with Sophronitis, Sophronitis with Epidendrum, Odontoglossum with Zygopetalum, Coelogeny with Calanthe, one may credit almost anything. What should be stated on the other side will appear presently. How many hybrids have we now, established and passing from hand to hand as freely as natural species? There is no convenient record, but in the trade list of a French dealer those he is prepared to supply are set apart with Gallic precision. They number 416. But imagination and commercial enterprise are not less characteristic of the Gaul than precision. In the excellent manual of Messrs. Veitch, which has supplied me with a mass of details, I find 10 hybrid Calanthes, 13 hybrid Cattleyas, and 15 Loelias, besides 16 natural hybrids, species thus classed upon internal evidence, and the wondrous Sophrocatleya bi-generic, 14 Dendrobiums and 1 natural, 87 Cypripediums. But as for the number in existence, it is so great, and it increases so fast, that Messrs. Veitch have lost count. Phajus 1, but several from alliance with Calanthe; Chysis 2, Epidendrum 1, Miltonia 1 and 2 natural, Masdevallia 10 and 2 natural, and so on. And it must be borne in mind that these amazing results have been effected in one generation. Dean Herbert's achievements 80 years ago were not chronicled, and it is certain that none of the results survive. Mr. Sander of St. Albans preserves an interesting relic, the only one as yet connected with the science of orchidology. This is Cattleya hybrida, the first of that genus raised by Dominy, manager to Messrs. Veitch, at the suggestion of Mr. Harris of Exeter, to the stupefaction of our grandfathers. Mr. Harris will ever be remembered as the gentleman who showed Mr. Veitch's agent how orchids are fertilized, and started him on his career. This plant was lost for years, but Mr. Sander found it by chance in the collection of Dr. Janisch at Hamburg, and he keeps it as a curiosity, for in itself the object has no value. But this is a digression. Dominy's early success, actually the very first of garden hybrids to flower in 1856, was Calanthes dominii, offspring of Calanthes masuca by C. furcata. Be it here remarked that the name of the mother or seed parent always stands first. Another interest attaches to C. dominii. Both its parents belong to the Veratrifolia section of Calanthe, the terrestrial species, and no other hybrid has yet been raised among them. We have here one of the numberless mysteries disclosed by hybridization. The epiphytal Calanthes, represented by C. vestita, will not cross with the terrestrial, represented by C. veratrifolia, nor will the mules of either. We may give this up and proceed. In 1859 flowered C. Veitchii, from C. rosea, still called as a rule Limatodes rosea, by C. vestita. No orchid is so common as this, and none more simply beautiful. But although the success was so striking, and the way to it so easy, 20 years passed before even Messrs. Veitch raised another hybrid Calanthe. In 1878 Seden flowered Calanthes sedeni from C. Veitchii by C. vestita. Others entered the field then, especially Sir Trevor Lawrence, Mr. Cookson, and Mr. Charles Wynn. But the genus is small, and they mostly chose the same families, often giving new names to the progeny, in ignorance of each other's labour. The mystery I have alluded to recurs again and again. Large groups of species refuse to intermarry with their nearest kindred, even plants which seem identical in the botanist's point of view. There is good ground for hoping, however, that longer and broader experience will annihilate some, at least, of the axioms current in this matter. Thus it is repeated and published in the very latest editions of standard works that South American Cattleyas, which will breed not only among themselves but also with the Brazilian Loelias, decline an alliance with their Mexican kindred. But Baron Schroeder possesses a hybrid of such typical parentage as Cattleya citrina, Mexican, and Cattleya intermedia, Brazilian. It was raised by Miss Harris of Lamberhurst, Kent, one single plant only, and it has flowered several times. Messrs. Sander have crossed Cattleya guttata Leopoldii, Brazil, with Cattleya dowiana, Costa Rica, giving Cattleya chamberliana. Loelia Christa, Brazil, with the same, giving Loelia Cattleya Pallas. Cattleya citrina, Mexico, with Cattleya intermedia, Brazil, giving Cattleya citrina intermedia. Note Lamberhurst hybrid. End note. Loelia flava, Brazil, with Cattleya skinneri, Costa Rica, giving Loelia Cattleya mariottiana. Loelia pumila, Brazil, with Cattleya dowiana, Costa Rica, giving Loelia Cattleya normannii. Loelia digbyana, Central America, with Cattleya mossii, Venezuela, giving Loelia Cattleya digbyana mossii. Cattleya mossii, Venezuela, with Loelia cinnabarina, Brazil, giving Loelia Cattleya Phoebe. Not yet flowered and unnamed, raised in the nursery, are Cattleya citrina, Mexico, with Loelia purpurata, Brazil, Cattleya harrisonii, Brazil, with Cattleya citrina, Mexico, Loelia anceps, Mexico, with Epidendrum ciliare, U.S. Colombia. In other genera there are several hybrids of Mexican and South American parentage, as Loelia anceps by Epidendrum ciliare, Sophronitis grandiflora by Epidendrum radicans, Epidendrum xanthium by Epidendrum radicans. But among Cypripediums, the easiest and safest of all orchids to hybridize, East Indian and American species are unfruitful. Messrs. Veitch obtained such a cross, as they had every reason to believe, in one instance. For 16 years the plants grew and grew, until it was thought they would prove the rule by declining to flower. I wrote to Messrs. Veitch to obtain the latest news. They inform me that one has bloomed at last. It shows no trace of the American strain, and they have satisfied themselves that there was an error in the operation or the record. Again, the capsules secured from the very many bigeneric crosses have proved time and again to contain not a single seed. In other cases the seed was excellent to all appearance, but it has resolutely refused to germinate. And further, certain bigeneric seedlings have utterly ignored one parent. Zygopetalum Mackayi has been crossed by Mr. Veitch, Mr. Cookson, and others doubtless, with various Odontoglossums, but the flower has always turned out Zygopetalum Mackayi, pure and simple, which becomes the more unaccountable more one thinks of it. Hybrids partake of the nature of both parents, but they incline generally, as in the extreme cases mentioned, to resemble one much more strongly than the other. When a Cattleya or Loelia of the single leaf section is crossed with one of the two leaf, some of the offspring from the same capsule show two leaves, others one only, and some show one and two alternately, obeying no rule perceptible to us at present. So it is with the charming Loelia Maynardii, from Loelia Diana by Cattleya dolosa, just raised by Mr. Sander, and named after the superintendent of his hybridizing operations. Cattleya dolosa has two leaves, Loelia Diana one. The product has two and one alternately. Sepals and petals are alike in colour, rosy crimson, veined with a deeper blue, lip brightest crimson lake, long, broad, and flat, curving in handsomely above the column, which is closely depressed after the manner of Cattleya dolosa. The first bigeneric cross deserves a paragraph to itself, if only on that account, but its own merits are more than sufficient. Sophrocatleya batemaniana was raised by Messrs. Veitch from Sophronitis grandiflora by Cattleya intermedia. It flowered in August 1886, petals and sepals rosy scarlet, lip pale lilac, bordered with amethyst and tipped with rosy purple. But one natural hybrid has been identified among Dendrobes, the progeny, doubtless, of Dendrobia crassinode by D. Wardianum. Messrs. J. Laing have a fine specimen of this. It shows the growth of the latter species with the bloom of the former, but enlarged and improved. Several other hybrid crosses are suspected. Of artificial we have not less than 50. Phajus, it is often spelt Phajus, is so closely allied with Calanthe that for hybridizing purposes at least there is no distinction. Domini raised Phajus irroratus from Phajus grandifolius by Calanthe vestita. Seden made the same cross, but using the variety Calanthes var rubo-oculata, he obtained Phajus purpureus. The success is more interesting because one parent is evergreen, the other, Calanthe, deciduous. On this account probably very few seedlings survive. They show the former habit. Mr. Cookson alone has yet raised a cross between two species of Phajus, Phajus cooksoni from Phajus wallichii by Phajus tuberculosus. One may say that this is the best hybrid yet raised, saving Calanthe veitchii, if all merits be considered: stateliness of aspect, freedom in flowering, striking colour, ease of cultivation. One bulb will throw up 4 spikes. 28 have been counted in a 12-inch pot, each bearing perhaps 30 flowers. Seden has made 2 crossings of Chysis, both from the exquisite Chysis bractescens, one of the loveliest flowers that heaven has granted to this world, but sadly fleeting. Nobody, I believe, has yet been so fortunate as to obtain seed from Chysis aurea. This species has the rare privilege of self-fertilization. We may well exclaim, why? Why? And it eagerly avails itself thereof so soon as the flower begins to open. Thus, however watchful the hybridizer may be, hitherto he has found the pollen masses melted in hopeless confusion before he can secure them. One hybrid epidendrum has been obtained, Epidendrum O'Brienianum, from Epidendrum evectum by Epidendrum radicans. The former purple, the latter scarlet, produce a bright crimson progeny. Miltonias show 2 natural hybrids and 1 artificial, Miltonia bleuiana from Miltonia vexillaria by Miltonia Yearsley, Both of these are commonly classed as odontoglots, and I refer to them elsewhere under that title. M. Bleu and Messrs. Veitch made this cross about the same time, but the seedlings of the former flowered in 1889, of the latter in 1891. Here we see an illustration of the advantage which French horticulturists enjoy, even so far north as Paris. A clear sky and abundant sunshine make a difference of more than 12 months. When Italians begin hybridizing, we shall see marvels, and Greeks and Egyptians. Masdevallias are so attractive to insects, by striking colour as a rule, and sometimes by strong smell, so very easily fertilized also, that we should expect many natural hybrids in the genus. They are not forthcoming, however. Reichenbach displayed his scientific instinct by suggesting that 2 species submitted to him might probably be the issues of parents named. Since that date, Seden has produced both of them from the crosses which Reichenbach indicated. We have 3 natural hybrids among Phalaenopsis. Phalaenopsis intermedia made its appearance in a lot of Phalaenopsis Aphrodite, imported 1852. M. Porte, a French trader, brought home 2 in 1861. They were somewhat different, and he gave them his name. Messrs. Lowe imported several in 1874, one of which, being different again, was called after Mr. Brymer. 3 have been found since, always among Phalaenopsis Aphrodite. The finest known is possessed by Lord Rothschild. That these were natural hybrids could not be doubted. Seden crossed Phalaenopsis Aphrodite with Phalaenopsis rosea, and proved it. Our garden hybrids are 2, Phalaenopsis FL Ames, obtained from Phalaenopsis amabilis by Phalaenopsis intermedia, and Phalaenopsis Harrieti, from Phalaenopsis amabilis by Phalaenopsis violacea, named after the daughter of Hon. Erastus Corning, of Albany, USA. Oncidiums yield only 2 natural hybrids at present, and those uncertain. Others are suspected. We have no garden hybrids, I believe, as yet. So it is with Odontoglossums, as has been said, but in the natural state they cross so freely that a large proportion of the species may probably be hybrids. I allude to this hereafter. I have left Cypripediums to the last in these hasty notes, because that supremely interesting genus demands more than a record of dry facts. Darwin pointed out that Cypripedium represents the primitive form of orchid. He was acquainted with no links connecting it with the later and more complicated genera. Some have been discovered since that day, but it is nevertheless true that an enormous extinction must have swept away a multitude of intermediate forms, and left this single genus as the record of a former and more simple state of the great Orchidacean order. The geographical distribution shows that Cypripedium was more common in early times, to speak vaguely, and covered an area yet more extensive than now. And the process of extermination is still working, as with other primitive types. Messrs. Veitch point out that although few genera of plants are scattered so widely over the earth as Cypripedium, the species have withdrawn to narrow areas, often isolated and remote from their kindred. Some are rare to the degree that we may congratulate ourselves upon the chance which put a few specimens in safety under glass before it was too late, for they seem to have become extinct even in this generation. Messrs. Veitch give a few striking instances. All the plants of Cypripedium fairieanum known to exist have sprung from 3 or 4 casually imported in 1856. 2 bits of Cypripedium superbiens turned up among a consignment of Cypripedium barbatum. None have been found since, and it is doubtful whether the species survives in its native home. Only 3 plants of Cypripedium mastersianium have been discovered. They reached Mr. Bull in a miscellaneous case of Cypripediums forwarded to him by the director of the Botanic Gardens at Buit-Zenorzy in Java, but that gentleman and his successors in office have been unable to find another plant. These 3 must have reached the gardens by an accident, as they left it, presented perhaps by some Dutchman who had been travelling. Cypripedium purpuratum is almost extinct at Hong Kong, and is vanishing fast on the mainland. It is still found occasionally in the garden of a peasant, who, we are told, resolutely declines to sell his treasure. This may seem incredible to those who know the Chinaman, but Mr. Roebelin vouches for the fact. It is one more eccentricity to the credit of that people, who had quite enough already. Collectors expect to find a new habitat of Cypripedium purpuratum in Formosa, when they are allowed to explore that realm. Even our native Cypripedium calceolus has almost disappeared. We get it now from Central Europe, but in several districts where it abounded the supply grows continually less. The same report comes from North America and Japan. Fortunate it is, but not surprising to the thoughtful observer, that this genus grows and multiplies with singular facility when its simple wants are supplied. There is no danger that a species which has been rescued from extinction will perish under human care. This seems contradictory. How should a plant thrive better under artificial conditions than in the spot where nature placed it? The reason lies in that archaic character of the Cypriped which Darwin pointed out. Its time has passed. Nature is improving it off the face of the earth. A gradual change of circumstances makes it more and more difficult for this primitive form of orchid to exist, and, conscious of the fate impending, it gratefully accepts our help. One cause of extermination is easily grasped. Cypripeds have not the power of fertilizing themselves, except a single species, Cypripedium schlimii, which accordingly, as we may say, is most difficult to import and establish. Moreover, it flowers so freely that the seedlings are always weak. In all species the sexual apparatus is so constructed that it cannot be impregnated by accident, and few insects can perform the office. Dr. Hermann Müller studied Cypripedium calceolus assiduously in this point of view. He observed only 5 species of insect which fertilize it. Cypripedium calceolus has perfume and honey, but none of the tropical species offer those attractions. Their colour is not showy. The labellum proves to be rather a trap than a bait. Large insects which creep into it and duly bear away the pollen masses are caught and held fast by that sticky substance when they try to escape through the lateral passages, which smaller insects are too weak to force their way through. Natural hybrids occur so rarely that their existence is commonly denied. The assertion is not quite exact, but when we consider the habits of the genus, it ceases to be extraordinary that Cypripeds rarely cross in their wild state. Different species of Cattleya, Odontoglots, and the rest live together on the same tree side by side, but those others dwell apart in the great majority of cases, each species by itself, at a vast distance perhaps from its kindred. The reason for this state of things has been mentioned. Natural laws have exterminated them in the spaces between, which are not so well fitted to maintain a doomed race. Doubtless Cypripeds rarely fertilize, by comparison that is, of course, in their native homes. The difficulty that insects find in performing that service has been mentioned. Mr. Godseff points out to me a reason far more curious and striking. When a bee displaces the pollen masses of a Cattleya, for instance, they cling to its head or thorax by means of a sticky substance attached to the pollen cases. So, on entering the next flower, it presents the pollen outwards to the stigmatic surface. But in the case of a Cypriped there is no such substance. The adhesive side of the pollen itself is turned outward, and it clings to any intruding substance. But this is the fertilizing part. Therefore, an insect which by chance displaces the pollen mass carries it off, as one may say, the wrong side up. On entering the next flower, it does not commonly present the surface necessary for impregnation, but a sterile globule, which is the backing thereof. We may suppose that in the earlier age, when this genus flourished, as the later forms of orchid do now, it enjoyed some means of fertilization which have vanished. Under such disadvantages, it is not to be expected that seed capsules would be often found upon imported Cypripeds. Messrs. Veitch state that they rarely observed one among the myriads of plants that have passed through their hands. With some species, however, it is not by any means so uncommon. When Messrs. Thompson of Clovenfords bought a quantity of the first Cypripedium spicerianum which came upon the market, they found a number of capsules, and sowed them, obtaining several hundred fine plants. Pods are often imported on Cypripedium insigne, full of good seed. In the circumstances enumerated we have the explanation of an extraordinary fact. Hybrids or natural species of Cypripediums artificially raised are stronger than their parents, and they produce finer flowers. The reason is that they get abundance of food in captivity, and all things are made comfortable for them, whilst nature, anxious to be rid of a form of plant no longer approved, starves and neglects them. The same argument enables us to understand why Cypripeds lend themselves so readily to the hybridizer. Darwin taught us to expect that species which can rarely hope to secure a chance of reproduction will learn to make the process as easy and as sure as the conditions would admit, that none of those scarce opportunities may be lost. And so it proves. Orchidaceans are apt to declare that everybody is hybridizing Cypripeds nowadays. At least, so many persons have taken up this agreeable and interesting pursuit that science has lost count of the less striking results. Briefly, the first hybrid Cypripedium was raised by Dominy in 1869, and named after Mr. Harris, who, as has been said, suggested the operation to him. Seden produced the next in 1874, Cypripedium sedeni, from Cypripedium schlumii by Cypripedium longiflorum. Curious, as the single instance yet noted in which seedlings turn out identical, whichever parent furnish the pollen masses. In every other case they vary when the functions of the parents are exchanged. End of section 14. About Orchids, a chat. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Peter Yearsley. About Orchids, a chat, by Frederick Boyle. Chapter 9. Orchids and Hybridization. Section 2. For a long time after 1853, when serious work begun, Messrs. Veitch had a monopoly of the business. It is but 40 years, therefore, since experiments commenced, in which time hundreds of hybrids have been added to our list of flowers. But this is my point. Nature has been busy at the same task for unknown ages, and who can measure the fruits of her industry? I do not offer the remark as an argument. Our observations are too few as yet. It may well be urged that if nature had been thus active, the natural hybrids which can be recognized would be much more numerous than they are. I have pointed out that many of the largest genera show very few, many none at all. But is it impossible that the explanation appears to fail only because we cannot yet push it far enough? When the hybridizer causes by force a fruitful union betwixt two genera, he seems to triumph over a botanical law. But suppose the genera themselves are artificial, only links in a grand chain which nature has forged slowly, patiently, with many a break and many a failure, in the course of ages. She would finish her work bit by bit, and at every stage the new variety may have united with others in endless succession. Few natural hybrids can be identified among Cattleyas, for instance. But suppose Cattleyas are all hybrids, the result of promiscuous intercourse among genera during cycles of time. Suppose, that is, the genus itself sprang from parents widely diverse, crossing, returning, intercrossing from age to age. It is admitted that Cypripedium represents a primeval form, perhaps the primeval form, of orchid. Suppose that we behold in this 19th century a mere epoch or stage in the ceaseless evolution. Only an irresponsible amateur could dare talk in this way. It would, in truth, be very futile speculation if experiments already successful did not offer a chance of proof one day, and others, hourly ripening, did not summon us to think. I may cite, with the utmost brevity, 2 or 3 facts which, to me unscientific, appear inexplicable, unless species of orchid were developed on the spot, or the theory of special local creations be admitted. Oncidium cuculatum flourishes in certain limited areas of Peru, of Ecuador, of Colombia, and of Venezuela. It is not found in the enormous spaces between, nor are any Oncidiums which might be accepted as its immediate parents. Can we suppose that the winds or the birds carried it over mountain ranges and broad rivers more than 2000 miles, in 4 several directions to establish it upon a narrow tract. It is a question of faith, but for my own part I could as soon believe that aesthetic emigrants took it with them. But even winds and birds could not bear the seeds of Dendrobium heterocarpum from Ceylon to Burma, and from Burma to Luzon in the Philippines. At least, I am utterly unable to credit it. If the plants were identical, or nearly, in their different habitats, this case would be less significant. But the Dendrobium heterocarpum of Ceylon has a long, thin pseudobulb with bright yellow flowers. That of Burma is short and thick, with paler colouring. That of Luzon is no less than 3 feet high, exaggerating the stature of its most distant relative, while showing the colour of its nearest. But all absolutely the same botanic plant. I have already mentioned other cases. Experience hitherto suggests that we cannot raise Odontoglossum seedlings in this climate. Very, very few have ever been obtained. Attempts in France have been rather more successful. Baron Adolphe de Rothschild has 4 different hybrids of Odontoglossum in bud at this present moment in his garden at Armainvilliers, near Paris. M. Moreau has a variety of seedlings. Authorities admit now that a very great proportion of our Odontoglossums are natural hybrids. So many can be identified beyond the chance of error that the field for speculation has scarcely bounds. Odontoglossum excellens is certainly descended from O. pescatorii and O. triumphans, Odontoglossum elegans from O. cirrosum and O. hallii, Odontoglossum wattianum from O. harryanum and O. hystrix. And it must be observed that we cannot trace pedigree beyond the parents as yet, saving a very, very few cases. But unions have been contracting during cycles of time. Doubtless from the laws of things the orchid is latest born of nature's children in the world of flora, but mighty venerable by this time nevertheless. We can identify the mixed offspring of Odontoglossum crispum alexandri paired with O. gloriosum, with O. luteopurpureum, with O. lindleyanum. These parents dwell side by side, and they could not fail to mingle. We can already trace with assurance a few double crosses as Odontoglossum lancians, the result of an alliance between O. crispum alexandri and O. ruckerianum, which latter is a hybrid of the former with Odontoglossum gloriosum. When we observe O. Yearsley upon the bank of the river Corca, and O. vexillarium on the higher ground, whilst O. vexillarium superbum lives between, we may confidently attribute its peculiarity of a broad dark blotch upon the lip to the influence of O. Yearsley. So, taking station at Manios upon the Amazons, we find to eastward Cattleya superba, to westward C. eldorado, and in the midst C. Braemeriana, which it is safe to assume represents the union of the two. For that matter, the theory will very soon be tested, for M. Alfred Bleu has made the cross of C. superba and C. eldorado, and its flower is expected with no little interest. These cases, and many more, are palpable. We see a variety in the making at this date. 1,000 years hence, or 10,000, by more distant alliances, by a change of conditions, the variety may well have developed into a species, or by marriage excursions yet wider, it may have founded a genus. I have named Mr. Cookson several times. In fact, to discourse of hybridization for amateurs without reference to his astonishing record would be grotesque. One Sunday afternoon 10 years ago he amused himself with investigating the structure of a few Cypripeds, after reading Darwin's book, and he impregnated them. To his astonishment the seed vessel began to swell, and so did Mr. Cookson's enthusiasm simultaneously. He did not yet know, and happily these experiments gave him no reason to suspect, that pseudo-fertilization can be produced actually by anything. So intensely susceptible is the stigmatic surface of the Cypriped that a touch excites it furiously. Upon the irritation caused by a bit of leaf, it will go sometimes through all the visible processes of fecundation. The ovary will swell and ripen, and in due time burst, with every appearance of fertility. But of course there is no seed. Beginners, therefore, must not be too sanguine when their bold attempts promise well. From that day Mr. Cookson gave his leisure to hybridization, with such results as, in short, are known to everybody who takes an interest in orchids. Failures in abundance he had at first, but the proportion has grown less and less, until at this moment he confidently looks for success in 75% of his attempts. But this does not apply to bigeneric crosses, which hitherto have not engaged his attention much. Beginning with Cypripedium, he has now 94 hybrids, very many plants of each, produced from 140 capsules sown. Of Calanthe, 16 hybrids from 19 capsules. Of Dendrobium, 36 hybrids from 41 capsules. Of Masdevallia, 4 hybrids from 17 capsules. Of Odontoglossum, none from 9 capsules. Of Phajus, 2 from 2 capsules. Of Vanda, none from 1 capsule. Of bigeneric, 1 from 9 capsules. There may be another, indeed, but the issue of an alliance so startling, and produced under circumstances so dubious, that Mr. Cookson will not own it until he sees the flower. It does not fall within the scope of this chapter to analyse the list of this gentleman's triumphs, but even savants will be interested to hear a few of the most remarkable crosses therein, for it is not published. I cite the following haphazard. Reader's note. I omit 28 named crosses between members of the genera Phajus, Loelia, Cattleya, Cypripedium, Dendrobium, and Masdevallia. End reader's note. Of these, and so many more, Mr. Cookson has at this moment 15,000 plants. Since my object is to rouse the attention of amateurs that they may go and do likewise, I may refer lightly to a consideration which would be out of place under other circumstances. Professional growers of orchids are fond of speculating how much the Wylam collection would realize if judiciously put on the market. I shall not mention the estimates I have heard. It is enough to say that they reach many, many thousands of pounds, that the difference between the highest and the lowest represents a handsome fortune, and this great sum has been earned by brains alone, without increase of expenditure, by boldness of initiative, thought, care, and patience, without special knowledge also at the beginning. For 10 years ago Mr. Cookson had no more acquaintance with orchids than is possessed by every gentleman who takes an interest in them, while his gardener, the early time, was both ignorant and prejudiced. This should encourage enterprise, I think, the revelation of means to earn great wealth in a delightful employment. But amateurs must be quick. Almost every professional grower of orchids is preparing to enter the field. They, however, must needs give the most of their attention to such crosses as may be confidently expected to catch the public fancy, as has been said. I advise my readers to be daring, even desperate. It is satisfactory to learn that Mr. Cookson intends to make a study of bigeneric hybridization henceforward. Footnote. Mr. Cookson writes to me, "Give some of the credit to my present gardener, William Murray, who is entitled to a large proportion at least." End footnote. The common motive for crossing orchids is that, of course, which urges the florist in other realms of botany. He seeks to combine tints, forms, varied peculiarities in a new shape. Orchids lend themselves to experiment with singular freedom, within certain limits, and their array of colours seems to invite our interference. Taking species and genera all round, yellow dominates, owing to its prevalence in the great family of Oncidium. Purples and mauves stand next, by reason of their supremacy among the Cattleyas. Green follows, if we admit the whole group of epidendrums, the great majority of which are not beautiful, however. Of magenta, the rarest of natural hues, we have not a few instances. Crimson, in 1,000 shades, is frequent. Pure white, a little rare. Orange, much rarer. Scarlet, very uncommon, and blue almost unknown, though supremely lovely in the few instances that occur. Thus the temptation to hybridize with the object of exchanging colours is peculiarly strong. It becomes yet stronger by reason of the delightful uncertainty which attends one's efforts. So far as I have heard or read, no one has yet been able to offer a suggestion of any law which decides the result of combination. In a general way, both parents will be represented in the offspring, but how, to what degree either will dominate, in what parts, colours or fashions a hybrid will show its mixed lineage, the experienced refuse to conjecture, saving certain easy classes. After choosing parents thoughtfully, with a clear perception of the aim in view, one must go it blind. Very often the precise effect desired appears in due time. Very often something unlooked for turns up. But nearly always the result is beautiful, whether or no it serve the operator's purpose. Besides effect, however, there is an utility in hybridization which relates to culture. Thus, for example, the lovely Cypripedium faireanum is so difficult to grow that few dealers keep it in their stock. By crossing it with Cypripedium barbatum from Mount Ophir, a rough and ready cool species, we get Cypripedium vexillarium, which takes after the latter in constitution while retaining much of the beauty of the former. Or, again, Cypripedium sanderianum from the Malay archipelago needs such swampy heat as few even of its fellows appreciate. It has been crossed with Cypripedium insigne, which will flourish anywhere, and though the seedlings have not yet bloomed, there is no reasonable doubt that they will prove as useful and beautiful as in the other case. Cypripedium insigne, of the fine varieties, has been employed in a multitude of such instances. There is the striking Cypripedium hirsutissimum, with sepals of a nameless green, shaded yellow, studded with spiculae, exquisitely frilled, and tipped, by a contrast almost startling, with pale purple. It is very hot in the first place, and in the second its appearance would be still more effective if some white could be introduced. Present it to Cypripedium niveum, and confidently expect that the progeny will bear cooler treatment, whilst their dorsal sepal will be blanched. So the charming Masdevallia tovarensis, warm, white, and lowly, will take to itself the qualities in combination of Masdevallia bella, tall, cool, and highly coloured red and yellow, as Mr. Cookson has proved. So Phaloenopsis whitii, delicate of growth and small of flower, will become strong and generous by union with Phaloenopsis grandiflora, without losing its dainty tones. It is worth mention that the first Flora medal offered by the Royal Horticultural Society for a seedling, a hybrid, in open competition, was won by Loelia arnoldiana in 1891. The same variety took the first prize in 1892. It was raised by Messrs. Sander from Loelia purpurata by Cattleya labiata, seed sown 1881, flowered 1891. And now for the actual process by which these most desirable results, and 10,000 others, may be obtained. I shall not speak upon my own authority, which the universe has no reason to trust. Let us observe the methods practised in the great establishment of Mr. Sander at St. Albans. Remark, in the first place, the low, unshaded range of houses devoted to hybridization, a contrast to those lofty structures 100 yards long or more, where plants merely flourish and bloom. Their span roofs one may touch with the hand, and their glass is always newly cleaned. The first and last demand of the hybridizer is light. Light, eternally light. Want of it stands at the bottom of all his disappointments, perhaps. The very great majority of orchids, such as I refer to, have their home in the tropics. Even the cool Odontoglots and Masdevallias owe that quality to their mountaineering habit, not to latitude. They live so near the equator that sunshine descends almost perpendicularly, and the sun shines for more than half the year. But in this happy isle of ours, upon the very brightest day of midsummer, its rays fall at an angle of 28 degrees, declining constantly until at midwinter they struggle through the fogs at an inclination of 75°. The reader may work out this proportion for himself, but he must add to his reckoning the thickness of our atmosphere at its best, and the awful number of cloudy days. We cannot spare one particle of light. The ripening seed must stand close beneath the glass, and however fierce the sunshine, no blind may be interposed. It is likely that the mother plant will be burnt up, quite certain that it will be much injured. This house is devoted to the hybridizing of Cypripediums. I choose that genus for our demonstration, because, as has been said, it is so very easy and so certain that an intelligent girl mastered all its eccentricities of structure after a single lesson, which made her equally proficient in those of dendrobes, oncidiums, odontoglots, epidendrums, and I know not how many more. The leaves are green and smooth as yet, with many a fantastic bloom, and many an ovary that has just begun to swell, rising amidst the verdure. Each flower spike which has been crossed carries its neat label, registering the father's name and the date of union. Mr. Maynard takes the first two virgin blooms to hand, Cypripedium Sanderianum and Cypripedium Godefroyii, as it chances. Let us cut off the lip in order to see more clearly. Looking down now upon the flower, we mark two wings, the petals, which stood on either side of the vanished lip. From the junction of these wings issues a round stalk, about 1/4 of an inch long, and slightly hairy, called the column. It widens out at the tip, forming a pretty table, rather more than 1/3 of an inch long and wide. This table serves no purpose in our inquiry. It obstructs the view, and we will remove it. But the reader understands, of course, that these amputations cannot be performed when business is intended. Now, the table snipped off, we see those practical parts of the flower that interest us. Beneath its protection, the column divides into three knobbly excrescences, the central plane, those on either side of it, curling back and down, each bearing at its extremity a pad the size of a small pin's head, outlined distinctly with a brown colour. It is quite impossible to mistake these things. Equally impossible, I hope, to misunderstand my description. The pads are the male, the active organs. But the column does not finish here. It trends downward, behind and below the pads, and widens out with an exquisitely graceful curve into a disc 1/4 of an inch broad. This is the female, the receptive part. But here we see the peculiarity of orchid structure, for the upper surface of the disc is not susceptible. It is the under surface which must be impregnated, though the imagination cannot conceive a mere accident which would throw those fertilizing pads upon their destined receptacle. They are loosely attached, and adhesive when separated to a degree actually astonishing, as is the disc itself. But if it were possible to displace them by shaking, they could never fall where they ought. Some outside impulse is needed to bring the parts together. In their native home, insects perform that service. Sometimes. Here we may take the first implement at hand, a knife, a bit of stick, a pencil. We remove the pads, which yield at a touch and cling to the object. We lay them, one by one, on the receptive disc, where they seem to melt into the surface, and the trick is done. Write out your label, Cypripedium Sanderianum by Cypripedium Godefroyii, Maynard. Add the date, and leave Nature to her work. She does not linger. One may almost say that the disc begins to swell instantly. That part which we term the column is the termination of the seed purse, the ovary, which occupies an inch, or 2 or 3, of the stalk behind the flower. In a very few days its thickening becomes perceptible. The unimpregnated bloom falls off at its appointed date, as everybody knows. But if fertilized, it remains entire, saving the labellum, until the seed is ripe, perhaps half a year afterwards, but withered, of course. Very singular and quite inexplicable are the developments that arise in different genera, or even species, after fertilization. In the Warscewiczulas, for example, not the seed purse only, but the whole column swells. Phaloenopsis ludmaniana is specially remarkable. its exquisite bars and mottlings of rose, brown, and purple begin to take a greenish hue forthwith. A few days later the lip jerks itself off with a sudden movement, as observers declare. Then the sepals and petals remaining take flesh, thicken and thicken, while the hues fade and the green encroaches, until presently they assume the likeness of a flower, abnormal in shape but perfect, of dense green wax. This Cypripedium of ours will ripen its seed in about 12 months, more or less. Then the capsule, 2 inches long and 2/3 of an inch diameter, will burst. Mr. Maynard will cut it off, open it wide, and scatter the thousands of seeds therein, perhaps 150,000, over pots in which orchids are growing. After experiments innumerable, this has been found the best course. The particles, no bigger than a grain of dust, begin to swell at once, reach the size of a mustard seed, and in 5 or 6 weeks, or as many months, they put out a tiny leaf, then a tiny root, presently another leaf, and in 4 or 5 years we may look for the hybridized flower. Long before, naturally, they have been established in their own pots. Strange incidents occur continually in this pursuit, as may be believed. 9 years since, Mr. Godseff crossed Catasetum macrocarpum with Catasetum callosum. The seed ripened, and in due course it was sown, but none ever germinated in the proper place. A long while afterwards, Mr. Godseff remarked a tiny little green speck in a crevice above the door of this same house. It grew and grew very fast, never receiving water unless by the rarest accident, until those experts could identify a healthy young Catasetum, and there it has flourished ever since, receiving no attention, for it is the first rule in orchid culture to leave a plant to itself where it is doing well, no matter how strange the circumstances may appear to us. This Catasetum, wafted by the wind when the seed was sown, found conditions suitable, where it lighted and quickened, while all its fellows, carefully provided for, died without a sign. It thrives upon the moisture of the house. In a very few years it will flower. In another case, when all hope of the germination of a quantity of seed had long been lost, it became necessary to take up the wooden trellis that formed the flooring of the path. A fine crop of young hybrids was discovered, clinging to the underside. The amateur who has followed us thus far with interest may inquire how long it will be before he can reasonably expect to see the outcome of our proceedings. In the first place, it must be noted that the time shortens continually as we gain experience. The statements following I leave unaltered, because they are given by Messrs. Veitch, our oldest authority, in the last edition of their book. But at the Temple Show this year, Norman C. Cookson, Esquire, exhibited Cattleya William Murray, offspring of Cattleya Mendelii by Cattleya Lawrenceana, a lovely flower which gained a first-class certificate. It was only 4 years old. The quickest record as yet is Calanthe Alexanderii, with which Mr. Cookson won a first-class certificate of the Royal Horticultural Society. It flowered within 3 years of fertilizing. As a genus, perhaps, Dendrobiums are readiest to show. Plants have actually been pricked out within 2 months of sowing, and they have bloomed within the 4th year. Phajus and Calanthe rank next for rapid development. Masdevallia, Chysis, and Cypripedium require 4 to 5 years, Lycaste 7 to 8, Loelia and Cattleya 10 to 12. These are Mr. Veitch's calculations in a rough way, but there are endless exceptions, of course. Thus his Loelia triophthalma flowered in its 8th season, while his Loelia caloglossa delayed till its 19th. The genus Zygopetalum, which plays odd tricks in hybridizing, as I have mentioned, is curious in this matter also. Zygopetalum maxillare, crossed with Z. Mackay, demands 5 years to bloom, but vice versa 9 years. There is a case somewhat similar, however, among the Cypripeds. Cypripedium schlimii, crossed with C. longifolium, flowers in 4 years, but vice versa in 6. It is not to be disputed, therefore, that the hybridizer's reward is rather slow in coming. The more earnestly should he take measures to ensure, as far as is possible, that it be worth waiting for. End of Chapter 9, and the end of About Orchids a Chat by Frederick Boyle.